ekinlar bilan birgalikda qaraydigan bo'lsak, o'ziga xos afzalliklari bor. Demak, saqlashda, uzoq muddat saqlashda imkoniyatlari bor. Demak, yetishtirishda
Good morning, everybody here in Samarkand, and good morning to everybody watching online. My name's David Shukman. For many years, I was a BBC News correspondent, and seeing those images of the Aral Sea really has a profound impact on me. One of my assignments for the BBC was to the Aral Sea 20 years ago, exactly. And I don't know who's had a chance to go there, but it's an extraordinary sight, an extraordinary warning, I think, of how readily, how easily, how rapidly a thriving community can be destroyed. We're going to hear more about that from our panel in a second. We've all heard about the climate crisis, haven't we? That's a term that's used a lot these days. Less well known, but I think as important, is the nature crisis. And if you look at the statistics for the number of species being lost, the number of habitats being destroyed, scientists call this the sixth mass extinction. The fifth was when the asteroid hit planet Earth 65 million years ago and killed the dinosaurs. Basically, what we're doing to the natural world is the equivalent of an asteroid hitting planet Earth in terms of what's being lost. And I know I get this all the time in conversations with people, particularly in the business world, that, look, it's very sad if the tigers get wiped out. It's very sad if some rare plant kind of goes extinct. But what's it got to do with me? You also hear the argument that nothing should stand in the way of economic development. Nothing is more important. So what's really interesting, and I think valuable and fundamentally important about some research in the last 5-6 years, is to show that when you lose species, you're not just losing a cute animal, like a panda or whatever. When you undermine biodiversity, you're actually undermining your economy. And there's now more and more evidence from very, very good scientific work that's gone through peer review and publication that shows the critical importance to national economies, regional economies, to businesses of what are now called natural ecosystem services. For example, the incredible economic value you get from bees pollinating fruit trees. There are studies about this in California. It runs into the hundreds of millions of dollars of value. If you have a river that's polluted and you clean it up, the fish return, and people who depend on that fish for their livelihoods can suddenly get back into business. There are so many examples of where if you put a price on nature, you can create a business model and you can restore nature. So that's very much our theme here today, and I'm delighted that the EBRD at this great annual meeting, has chosen to allocate time for this subject. I'm going to introduce our panel in just a second, but to kind of give you a flavor of what we're talking about, let's have a little video produced by WWF. Thank you.
Rampant wildfires, mass flooding, extreme temperatures. We are witnessing a planetary crisis unfold in real time, and every passing moment reveals a more pressing need for change. But where there is a problem, there is a solution. And when it comes to tackling the climate crisis, nature is our greatest ally. It's time we recognize its value. This is where nature-based solutions come into play. But what exactly do those look like? Nature-based solutions are all about working with nature instead of against nature. When we champion nature-based solutions, we all benefit from the results they provide for the issues facing our planet. Take mangroves, for example. If all mangroves were lost or destroyed, 15 million more people would be affected by floods across the world each year. This means mangrove forests not only provide habitats for fish, they also provide protective natural barriers and solutions against strong storms, floods and erosion. They filter water, provide food and timber resources to coastal communities, and can store huge amounts of carbon. Conserving and restoring these ecosystems allows people and nature to thrive, all the while reducing risks posed by the climate crisis. By working with nature like this and changing how we use land, researchers estimate we can reduce emissions by up to 1/3 of what's needed to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And mangroves aren't alone in their value. Other ecosystems also offer incredible solutions to issues we may not even think about, such as coral reefs, whose ability to reduce the intensity of waves is crucial to shielding tens of millions of people from floods. Some studies actually suggest they can be even more effective than human-built breakwaters at this task, or grasslands and savannas, which provide homes for wildlife and help capture and store carbon. The natural world does so much to sustain and protect us and all those we share this planet with. We must do the same in return, and we must do it now. Nature-based solutions are a win-win for each and every one of us, and it's time we pay attention to them.
What's really interesting seeing that video is how the issue of what's happening to the natural world, the need to restore biodiversity, has really escalated up the diplomatic agenda. So there was the meeting COP15 in Montreal last December. And I got the sense that suddenly governments have really woken up to what this means. It's one of these issues that's really come up the agenda and commanding a lot more attention. And one of the things it did was create a global biodiversity framework with a much more aggressive and active program of work that we'll hear about a little bit more in the session. So let me introduce our panel, and we've got a great variety of perspectives here, which is I think going to really create a fascinating debate. So just to my left here, Josip Kazbekov, who's Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Natural Resources here in Uzbekistan, and he's got a story to tell, like I do, and I think one or two here do, about the Aral Sea. He was brought up beside the Aral Sea, so that gives a real personal insight to all of that. Next to him, Elena Khan. We're delighted to have you here, Elena, with us. Elena runs an NGO. NGOs have played a vital role in raising concerns about all of this. She runs the Khorezm Rural Agricultural Support Service, also in the Aral Sea region. Next along, Sir Danny Alexander, who's a Vice President at the Asian Infrastructure Bank. Last but not least, by any means, Chantal Van Ham, is a consultant with Arcadis, an engineering consultancy, and a specialist in natural capital, biodiversity questions, and this whole crucial issue of how do you make a business case for conserving nature. Let's begin. I'm going to try and divide up the questions here so we sort of structure the discussion. I wonder, Minister, whether I could ask you first, from the point of view of Uzbekistan, your work in government, sort of how big a deal is nature? I mean, when you've seen the film, we've been discussing some of the issues around nature and biodiversity. Where does it rank as a priority for the Uzbek government?
Thank you, David. And I would like to appreciate EBRD to bringing this important issue on the agenda, and we would appreciate if these matters of environment, nature, and biodiversity will be included into their programs. And regarding your question, how and what rank government sees the nature, since 5 years ago, we started a new development, New Uzbekistan, and now recently we had an administrative reform where 3 different ministries or committees for environment protection, forestry, and the hydromet services were united into one big ministry of natural resources, and so that means that the government is trying to streamline its environmental agenda. And recently we met with our president, and he mentioned that the environment should come first, then economy. So
wait a minute, let me just hear that again. That's such an important and interesting point. He actually told you that the environment comes above economy.
Yes, he says without environment we cannot have a decent economy. And all the investments, what we are thinking, or all the projects will not work without the nature. So that's the priority the government of Uzbekistan putting on this issue.
That's really, really fascinating. And Elena, with your work, you're trying to help people in rural areas, and in particular, it's a region that's had a lot of environmental problems next to the Aral Sea. How do you view nature and biodiversity in your work as a priority?
Yes, coming from a very rural area in the northwest of Uzbekistan, from Khorezm, with a rich historical heritage, but with a bunch of environmental concerns of the Aral Sea region. These problems are not a book example for us. We have to live with that. But what is striking that we as locals, be it governmental organization, business or community, we got used to these problems. We got used to have dust and salt all around us.
Do you know, I remember the dust just everywhere. Yeah.
We got used to no trees around us, lack of water, but at the same time mismanagement of natural precious resources, which we have. And what we as NGO do, we try to deliver this information to farmers as land and water and as resource users, so they better know and better equipped with knowledge about improved technologies, so they can use in their daily practices, at least to reduce irrigation water, which is precious for our region.
So connection we've heard from the minister between environmental degradation or success and economic, financial well-being?
I think there is still a low level of perception and understanding among all about climate change that is happening, about the risks that we have and impacts, but about also possible solutions that everybody can take in his or her own power to bring this small efforts for a healthy environment around us. So we have to really improve that level of understanding and readiness to act.
Right, right. So it's a process of education, of raising awareness.
Definitely.
Danny Alexander, does that process of raising awareness also apply in the world of multilateral development banks? I mean, is it relatively recently that the AIIB has engaged with this agenda? To what extent have you had to overcome, I don't know, internal resistance, for example? Or what's the situation? How is it, and how does it stand now?
Firstly, let me thank the EBRD for hosting this panel and also for the EBRD's leadership in this area. We really appreciate the close partnership between AIB and EBRD on these biodiversity and climate change issues. I mean, AIB itself is quite a recent organization. We were only created in 2016, just a few weeks after the Paris Agreement was signed. And so, as with other multilateral development banks, environmental and social safeguards to high standard have been built into our projects from the beginning. And so that means thinking about, in any project that we finance, what is the impact on nature, how can that be mitigated or offset, depending on the particular case. I think what has come much more to the fore, even within the 7 years that AIB has existed, is the idea of nature-based solutions that were discussed here. You know, I think fundamentally we have to recognize nature is infrastructure. It's the infrastructure of life. As you said, ecosystem services, nature-based solutions can be the best way to solve many of the infrastructure challenges that we as human beings have. What's more, there's a growing recognition that the biodiversity, nature, and climate change, which is the crisis that has focused a lot of political attention and a lot of our resources and targets. In our case, we aim for at least half of our financing to be climate financing. But there's a recognition that these two crises have to be dealt with together, that they're intertwined. And especially when you look at climate change adaptation and resilience, as the film showed, nature is absolutely critical to protecting people from the effects of climate change. And then in the international community, just at the end of last year, the Common Framework on Biodiversity was agreed in the Montreal Summit. You know, so also among our shareholders, in our case 106 countries from all over the world, they're all telling us this is important. You have to take care of it. And so that is definitely spurring further action and further attention beyond just the safeguard issues towards what is the positive agenda that we can achieve through our finance.
Really interesting. And I really like the phrase, nature is infrastructure. I'm going to borrow that, maybe with credit. I don't know.
I think a footnote would always be welcome.
It's a very good one. Chantal, what's your perspective? You've worked in different organizations on this question. Before we get into specifics about solutions and how to advance this, give us your overall sense of whether it's becoming a more engaging topic, whether you're still encountering people who say, I don't get it, I don't know what it means, I'm not involved. What's your take?
Thank you for that question. I think that based on what we hear here, there's a lot of positive development and awareness and understanding that nature is our lifeline and it is the foundation for our economic prosperity. Actually, the services that nature provides, as we also saw in the video, amounts to $125 trillion a year. And in fact, many companies and financial institutions starting to also see the risk related to nature, in particular when it comes to value chain disruptions, price volatility, but also destruction of real assets. And there is the transition risk related to regulations, to potential denial of permits and reputation risks. And if we compare the investment in nature to, for example, the energy transition, at the moment we face a gap of $800 billion a year for nature, which now at the moment mainly comes from public funding.
So that's a gap between
now
what and what?
a yearly gap towards 2030 to achieve our global biodiversity framework. And if we look at investments being made today, then I think that every investment we should make should be nature positive, meaning going from what we've looked at now, avoiding harmful effects, to creating a positive future. And we as a global company in infrastructure and sustainable design, I work in a small team on natural capital valuation, so we try to guide businesses and financial institutions in how they can measure their nature-related risks and impacts, but also how they can make them part of their decision-making processes. And with that, we hope to because
relatively short-term threat to viability if this agenda isn't attended to.
Yeah.
Let's get into some specifics now about what can be done and what kind of practical steps and what on earth everyone's talking about. Minister, you were telling me before that you grew up beside the Aral Sea and you witnessed how rapidly where you lived went from being green to being dusty, and now that you're in a position of power, what can you do about it?
Thank you. We even joked that in one generation this changed with the RLC, and RLC is gone. All the issues, and I corrected my friend in half generation.
Yes, right.
So unfortunately, but fortunately, our government since 2016 took very, how to say, rapid actions. In 2017, our president, the General Assembly of the UN, he raised the issue of RLC and showed a map and brought attention of the world to this issue. And in 2018, we started massive tree plantation activities on the bottom of the RLC to stop that sand and the dust storms.
So what do the trees live on? I mean, having been there, it's just dry. There's no water.
It is saxaul trees. We have Cherkes, Karabarak, other kind of bush-type trees, which feel very good in the no-water environment. So until now, we reached about 2 million hectares of land, planted trees, and we see, last year we conducted monitoring, we see some animals are returning, some birds are coming back, so we will continue that, and also 1.5 years ago, our president initiated the Green Nation Initiative, Yaşıl Makon, to plant 1 billion trees over the next 5 years. With that, we also work with our nature conservation organizations. So IUCN last year,
yes, you just joined. Yeah.
We just joined as we started working on wildlife, zoonotic diseases. International Climate Initiative of Germany is funding. So FFI, we are working with fauna and flora, the WWF, the other. We are very serious on our actions, and we want to get results soon. And
That's really interesting and encouraging. And actually, on my next visit to the Aral Sea, I look forward to seeing these trees. That sounds like a...
And also we are working with our neighbors to establish, to expand our protected areas, like to establish transboundary protected areas.
Right.
With
Yes.
Turkmenistan in Usturt, with Kazakhstan on the Aral Sea, because we have these saiga migratory deers. And we are working with Tajikistan, also discussing establishing transboundary protected area national park in Hisar or Zarafshan areas. So I must say that until 2016 we only had 2 million hectares of protected areas. That's for 100 years, like 2 million hectares. So in last 5 years, we expanded that to 6.3 million hectares. So we tripled the area of the protected areas. Now it is more than 14% of our territory. But we won't stop. We will continue that.
You've got ambitions to go
expansion,
further. That's really interesting. And Elena, from your perspective, working on the ground with rural communities, what are the initiatives, what are the practical steps that you think deliver the best results for this? And I know in your film, which was running before, you had and perhaps with some more sustainable farming techniques. What are the things that you think are most useful to focus on?
Yeah, on the ground level, we try to be also in line with all governmental priorities set. And for example, crop diversification is stated in our programs. And thanks to our ever first grant and collaboration with EBRD, we managed to organize a capacity building for young farmers and entrepreneurs in using this crop diversification and planting alternative crop for the region, sesame, which is actually a less water demanding crop, which is tolerant and has a demand as export crop, but also in the home market. So out of this project, the way was also a tandem which we built with a businessman who wants to share his own expertise to deliver this knowledge to local land users about sustainable practices. And after this grant, we also opened a new NGO driven by business who wants to go into social entrepreneurship. And in our current project with GIZ, we want to try this organic practices, at least a step to understand these organic practices on our level.
So is there a way then, from what you're saying, where businesses can be encouraged to get involved, that they see a business opportunity to engage in some practice that is going to help restore the environment?
Yeah, there is an opportunity for business. The enabling environment, a policy environment is in there, but there should be more incentives for businessmen to freely operate, to crop whatever they want, of course according to the, let's say, maybe ecosystem principles as well. So there is a way for a small group who are very motivated and dedicated to that, because farmers, as elsewhere in the world, they want really tangible results first year, where we know that environmental approaches like nature-based solutions or whatsoever, they require not only 1 year, and the farmer can't wait. They have to feed their families. So there should be a consensus, let's say, yeah, with right. opportunity and what they can do in terms of that.
Danny and Alexandra, I'll come to you in just a second, but before, to ask you about practicalities, if you like, but just before we get there, Chantal, talk us through the process of putting a price on nature restoration, how you do that. I know there's a lot of cynicism about how do you get to these numbers? You know, what is the financial value of some natural ecosystem? How do you, I mean, we haven't got all night, obviously, but briefly, how do you do that?
Yes.
And why is it credible, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it is essential if we look at the crisis that we're in, because that is mainly due to the fact that we do not value natural capital, and that is something that needs to change. Of course, there's a lot of discussion on whether you should put a price on everything, because not everything can be expressed in quantitative terms. But what we've done together with the EBRD and with IDEA Group, a group of economists, is to develop a natural capital valuation model. And that is a way at which you can look at the landscape the ecosystem services provides and which risks related to nature emerge from that landscape, but also which opportunities. And we look at that from the level of habitats, the conditions of species, and scenarios for future development. So if we continue to work as we do now, business as usual, or whether we focus on a more sustainable investment approach. And with that, we can identify what we call nature-positive investment opportunities. We've applied that model in a number of areas where the EBRD is investing and is active, including the Aral Sea, but also the Red Sea, and for a particular project that's focusing on establishing a waste management facility in Serbia. And with that process, we also liaise closely with local stakeholders to understand whether the values that we quantify and monetize also resonate with the local circumstances, and that gives us a much better understanding of what the alternative options are to invest in.
Because the criticism I've heard, I'm sure you have as well, is that in a classic business model, there are hard numbers, there are estimates, everybody knows the language. But with this relatively new field, a lot of it's a bit subjective. Is it a little bit uncertain? Is it even a little bit flaky? What's your answer to that in terms of how robust your model is, in terms of giving hard numbers?
We deal, of course, with that complexity of biodiversity, which is much more challenging than climate change, for example, where we have a clear target. That is not the case for biodiversity, but we do make use of the best available knowledge and tools that we have in the market, and this natural capital valuation model is based on the UN system for economic accounting for ecosystems. So that is based on...
So you sort of mainstream this into the sort of classic economic models?
Yes, so it is an accounting system that you can even apply at a national level for decision-making processes, but we can do this at a landscape level and even at a project level. And for the EBRD, we've also looked at what is a new mechanism, the Task Force for Nature-Related Disclosure, which aims to help businesses and financial institutions to monitor what their real impact and also dependencies on nature are. And we have assessed the nature interface of a portfolio of EBRD projects over the past year, mainly focusing on climate change, to see which projects are in locations that have the most material risks and impacts on nature. And with that, you can look at sectors and subsectors of the economy in which you act that have the potential highest priority to start to determine these natural capital values.
So thank you for that. I'm just trying to picture at the level of the AIIB when you're weighing an investment. I'm kind of imagining that there might be people in the room who say, well, this nature stuff, do we really know? Do we really care? To what extent is the argument about this helped by having the kind of hard numbers drawn together in this kind of mainstream economic way to help bolster the case?
What Chantal says is absolutely essential. Until we know what we're measuring, how to count it, how to analyze it, how to understand it, really having a comprehensive approach in this spectrum is very difficult. It's also an area where collaboration among the multilateral development banks to develop common approaches and common understanding is really very important. So as we have on climate change over the past decade or more, working together to have common methodologies that we can all apply, common approaches. Now on climate, we're implementing Paris alignment, which means every single one of our projects has to be aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. After the agreement of the common framework, I think one of the objectives will be how can we also align our investments with that framework. That provides a way of understanding these issues that is critically important. Among the MDBs now there is a joint working group which is beavering away on these issues. We heard about what the EBRD is doing, and it's a leader in this field. We are also working on exactly these issues, how to understand and value natural capital, how to build that into the project assessments. But in the meantime, we're also picking up pilot projects that we can start to work on, that are nature-based solutions projects, from which we can also learn, as it were, from the bottom up. So this goes beyond the safeguards or the offsets that you might put into a regular infrastructure project, to look at projects where nature can be the focus. So, for example, we're working on a marine ecosystem restoration project in southern China, which is trying to restore natural habitats, wetlands, which provide vital economic services, also replanting mangroves, which give protection to people, but also help to improve the habitat, clean the water, as we saw in the film. Now, these pilot projects tend to be government-financed projects. And as the Minister said, when you have a government that really understands the importance of these issues, as we clearly do in Uzbekistan, and I think in other countries increasingly also, then that's one way in which you can start to develop the projects and the methodologies. I think the next challenge is how do you incentivize the private sector to work in those directions? Yes. And I think maybe that's where you start with for our projects, every project we do an analysis of the biodiversity impact, whether offsets need to be made, they can be made, or ecosystem improvements. So, for example, we're working on one railway project in Turkey where it interacts with the ecosystem of the white-headed duck, which may or may not be familiar to you, but it's a very important and rare species. And so that involved both managing the impact on the local ecosystem, but also restoring oak woodlands, which were important, and putting in place measures to stop the birds being hit by the trains. So, those kind of things, I think, also help to raise awareness among a variety of different parties about how to do it. But how to really mainstream it into the private sector, I think that is the next big challenge, and we're still not there in terms of what is the answer.
Well, you've set up the next section of this discussion
I'm
beautifully,
very sorry.
so thank you very much indeed, because it's often said, I've heard it, many of the climate COPs that I've been to, that the public sector can mobilize billions, but only the private sector can mobilize trillions. And the kind of numbers that you were talking about, Chantal, and others, in terms of nature restoration, how to deliver this agenda, it's going to take critical investment on a large scale by private sector. So, Minister, I wonder whether, in your thinking, at the government level, how you try to involve businesses. I mean, we heard Elena's example there of talking to local farmers, convincing them of a business case to farm in a more sustainable way and with crops that are less damaging and need less water. How do you, and having heard the fellow panelists, what can a government do to sort of mobilize what will be needed, which is vast amounts of private capital, and with those businesses seeing a return? I mean, that's a key element there. It's not charity here, is it?
First of all, I want to say that we have a concept for the development of protection of environment till 2030, and we adopted biodiversity strategy for Uzbekistan till 2028. So after Kunming and Montreal CBD Convention COP15, I think one of first countries started this early action program. We are working with Jeff and UNDP on reviewing all these strategies and making sure that by 2030 we are, as Chantal said, nature positive, and by 2050 we reach that living harmony with nature kind of vision. But with the RLC and all these challenges, and Uzbekistan depends, for example, like which is first, green economy is first, or blue? Blue, because 80% of water comes from our neighbors. So I think it's very big challenge for us. And as for us as a government, we are trying in our protected areas to improve our ecotourism services.
Right.
We are inviting PPP, public-private partnership models. We are establishing visit centers for tourists. For these kind of visit centers or some services, we try to invite business. And also for the RLC in 2021, by the initiative of our president, RLC region was announced at the General Assembly of UN. RLC region was announced as a zone of environmental innovations and technologies.
Okay.
So, as you mentioned, to turn the problems into solutions. So we in that program we have one model, business model, growing sistanke. I don't know how in English, but sistanke is some kind of algae crop which grows to near the saxaul trees in the desert, but it's a very high, how to say, cash crop.
Okay.
Very, I mean.
Is it used for food?
For heart.
Is it
I
a
think
nutritional
for medicine.
Medicine, okay.
I think,
right, so it's high value.
High value.
Yes.
Very high. For hard currency, for US dollars, it's very expensive. So in the RLC, we are trying to promote that, to grow that in like for business communities, to grow that and make a plantation.
So just to be clear, in that model, is the Uzbek government is paying for the planting of the trees, and then you try to encourage businesses to take advantage of the trees, but to do their own business with the algae next door.
And also we have Artemia. It's a small, what to say, mollusk.
Shrimp.
The tiniest shrimp in the RLC.
But I always think shrimp need water, right? Don't they?
Yeah. In the what's left of RLC.
Okay.
It's a higher. It's like higher than ocean salinity rate, but it's a good environment for these tiny shrimps. Artemia, we see. So Artemia business become, I mean, very attractive, and now we are also promoting PPP kind of model, business models to grow that also, not with the sea, but also like beyond the sea.
Thanks for sharing that. I mean, Chantal, when you hear those sorts of examples, do they chime with the kind of work you're doing? And I know before the session you told us about a scheme that you've been involved in Mexico. I mean, I guess we're in an era where everybody needs to share ideas and best practice. Would you just talk through, just in business terms, how it could work? I mean, whether this RLC, these examples resonate with you, and broadly how, in practical terms, a business case can be made.
Yeah, I think what this shows is how powerful that restorative capacity of nature is to start with, and that it also really is important to bring together all the actors in the landscape to build a case that is also financially viable. And in my work, I've also focused quite a lot on cities, and we've developed this idea of nature-based solutions to understand better what this can mean. So, for example, the city of Philadelphia made the calculation. They deal with a lot of heavy rain and flash floods. So either they could expand the existing hard infrastructure, so the sewer channels, or they could invest in natural solutions and permeability of soils. And then in the end, they have realized that it was much less expensive to invest in that natural solution than in the hard infrastructure solution. The same is the case actually in China, the sponge cities concept, which is a major investment, I think the biggest investment in nature-based solutions at the moment in the world, that is both public and privately funded, but that helps to increase the natural components of cities, some of the biggest cities in the world.
But sorry, just to interrupt your flow there, but how does a business make any money out of a nature-based solution that counters flooding? I mean, how does that work?
So there's a lot of need for technical experts, design, implementation of these solutions. So it is a growing market. We see that especially in Europe and also in the US, but now also in Asia, where we have a lot of expertise also in architecture firms and in the cities where procurement systems are being changed to really also include nature-based solutions as a criterion for giving the public investment to private partners who eventually implement and guide these types of processes.
Because, I mean, being a bit cynical about this, I mean, in the UK there are lots of examples of housing projects where it's a private developer, I mean, obviously with local authority permission, but private developer builds the houses and the roads and doesn't want the extra cost of planting trees. Doesn't see that in its business model there's a value. So how does one create a value then for a business in making that case?
Yeah, it is indeed not an easy process. I've worked closely with the city of Manchester, who is, I think, one of the few cities in Europe that has a natural capital investment plan, which has involved the private sector and all other stakeholders to integrate these types of solutions into the process. And they have eventually, as part of a big housing project for social improvement, included a park. They call it a park that drinks water, and that is inspired by this example from China, as Wuhan was one of their partner cities in this project. And yeah, it is indeed something that does take time and also willingness to look into alternative options. But initially, indeed, it may not always look as a short-term financial opportunity, and that is a real gap that we need to bridge, because we look at a very short-term perspective, whereas nature and the benefits that it results in often come at a longer term perspective.
So
I think
Danny, hearing that, I heard you itching to sort of get in.
I mean, I completely agree with what Chantal said, and actually the sponge cities concept in China is a very interesting example. In some cases, these nature-based solutions are as effective and considerably cheaper than the pouring large amounts of concrete and so forth. And sometimes the lack of willingness to embrace these ideas is to do with just not knowing about them, lack of information, or conservatism about the extent to which they've been proven and what are the risks and so forth. There are risks on both sides. We've seen it again and again, including in the UK and in China, the catastrophic consequences of for flooding when you have cities that are built entirely of concrete and the water has nowhere to go, right?
But how do you persuade businesses that they can get a revenue stream by investing in a way?
So of course, part of this is about the role of government and the role of regulation. You mentioned local authority permission, using those kind of systems. Part of it is about demonstrating the value. Part of it is about organizations like ours being able to, when we're discussing with project sponsors, being able to promote and explain these kind of solutions and why they're economically viable, beneficial, perhaps even more profitable. And of course, if you're a private sector developer and the risk of your business being destroyed by flooding is 1 in 10 and you can reduce it to 1 in 50, well, that's also a significant economic benefit to you and to the users of your infrastructure. So I think, again, this is an area where we need to do more to kind of perfect how we get these messages across. But I think there are lots of messages, both based on analysis and based on practical experience, where if we can pick up a project in one country, explain it, showcase it in other places, then that will enable that cycle of innovation to be accelerated.
Elena, in your experience working with the farmers, I mean, some measures that are, let's just say, more nature-friendly do incur extra cost. And if you're a small farmer, if you're a business, that isn't always something that's possible. How do you, when you're engaging with the people you work with, how do you try to explain that maybe that extra cost is worth it in some way, that they'll benefit in some way, there'll be, I don't know, a higher price for their products if the crops are grown in a regenerative way, for example?
Yeah, you're right. When addressing and talking to farmers, you need to talk with figures.
Figures, okay,
And
yeah.
money, costs, so you have to explain
This
that
is head, not heart,
Yes.
right? Okay.
this is that they understand quickly and that they need. Otherwise, all this talks about nature, you know, you cannot put nature in your pocket. So you have have to live.
Yeah.
So all these environmental friendly practices, which actually require a lot of time to see the tangible results, really need to come in with sound calculations and sound recommendations from the science as well, and which is lacking actually. Yeah, we need science on biodiversity values, on ecosystem services, on environmental footprints whatsoever. So we have to create this recommendation and promote, because farmers do believe in science. They do believe in practitioners with a scientific background from academia. So this way they also can hear and also they need vivid examples.
Yes. Yes. So actually the kind of evidence that you're gathering and creating in these systems all help with that. Minister, you...
I just wanted to add to what Elena said. As part of this Green Nation initiative, we have to plant so many trees, but how? And if we don't have water, enough water, how we can promote? So we use this kind of models, like in rural areas of Uzbekistan, traditionally women sit at home. So men bring rest. So we are creating model of providing seeds, tree seeds for women, and then they prepare seedlings of trees, and then we buy it back. I mean, so this kind of business model. Plus, we are working, we established, within our ministry, we established office in 2021, GGI, Global Green Growth Institute. We are working in Karakal, Pakistan, in RLC area of promoting tree growing with farmers. So if you plant trees around your fields like a windshield, you get like profit by so many percent, like 25 and 30%. They increase the profit of their agriculture fields. So
right.
So we are working on that research project.
So they get real numbers of the kind that Elena was talking about.
Yes.
Yeah.
So so that's the trees provide kind of this ecosystem service, which could be evaluated, I mean, as additional income for farmers. So we are working on raising awareness among our farmers, the importance of growing trees.
Really interesting. Now look, we've got into our last few minutes here, and I think it'd be a good moment to cast ahead. I mean, we've talked quite a bit about how just in the last few years, 5 years, 10 years, this agenda has become way more prominent. I mean, actually, I think it's really in the last year or so that it's really achieved more of an international status. And I know that next year there's another conference on nature. Governments under obligations to come up with biodiversity plans. Whether they do or not is another question. But nevertheless, there's now an accelerated timetable of diplomatic engagement on this issue. So one would imagine that we might see more movement on it. I'm just wondering whether, just pretty briefly, I'll just come along the line here, where you think we'll be. Let's take a 5-year view. I mean, I don't want to be exact about that, but I mean, is this a passing fashion, or is it something that's here to stay and will grow, and that we will be finding business models? Chantal, you kick us off there.
Thank you.
Just take a minute, let's say.
Yeah, I think the latter is the case, that this is...
It's here to stay.
It's here to stay. This is the future, and I think we'll see more and more new partnerships for action with governments, with the private sector, with NGOs, to build the capacity to learn how we can demonstrate that investing in nature is really going to help us.
And any lingering cynicism or questions about getting the numbers, that can be overcome?
Yeah, we're working on that in many ways with developing new tools, also using all the technologies we have, like remote sensing. There's all kinds of ways in which we can better access to data, as that is often the most important missing element for financial investors to invest in nature.
Thank you. That's great. You're going to, 5 years' time, I don't know what job you'll be in. If you're in the same job, are you going to be talking nature?
For sure. At COP26 2 years ago, all the MDBs put together a joint statement committing to mainstream nature into our strategies, policies, projects by 2025. And so we'll be talking even more about this. What's more, we're in a race against time in respect of climate change. You know, in this decade, if we don't take the action necessary, we'll not bend the curve to get global temperature rises down to 2 degrees or below as envisaged in the Paris Agreement. And that means a lot more investment in climate mitigation, adaptation, resilience. Nature is critical to all of those things. And so integrating the two together is going to be a very strong driver for much more rapidly mainstreaming nature into all of our activities, whether it's government regulation, financial sector reform, or investment of the kind that we do.
Thank you very much. Elena, from your perspective, you're doing your work on the ground. Cast ahead 5 years.
With such a rapid pace that government is showing commitment to nature conservation, I do believe that we have a much greater space for civil society to voice our opinions and bring our expertise in nature conservation, so we can show the examples of how small actions can be done on the local level, and we will try to create this nature responsibility, co-ownership with nature, co-ownership with local territories, and responsibility of us as individuals and of us as communities.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Minister, the last word to you. Look ahead 5 years. Where will nature stand in the hierarchy of Uzbek national priorities?
Of course, it will be on a high rank. What we are doing to do that is currently we are working on our transformation strategy. We are taking a lot of things to do. I mean, like enforcement, digitalization, PPP models, because not all the services government could do well. I mean, like we have to involve private sector, and also important thing is with the last changes in our government, like good reforms, is working with our population, with public. So we established a unit, the consultation body within our ministry to work with the activists and the NGOs and civil society representatives. So that will be for us very important, because who did the RLC issue, it is human, yeah? Humans did. So we have to work, I mean, with population, explaining what we are doing, and maybe to do this jointly. And also in April 30th, we adopted new constitution. So environmental issue got like a separate chapter on that. and it ensured the responsibility of the government in front of people about the quality of environment, and also importance of the working with the civil society.
Great, thank you very much indeed. That brings us to the end of this session. I mean, as we mentioned just now, I mean, it's clear from all the panelists that this issue is not going away. In fact, it's gaining in prominence. And as I mentioned, the next, the COP16 of this track will be another opportunity for discussion and pressure on governments to meet their promises. We know from the climate experience that promises made are not always kept, but I always think it's better to have the promises in the first place, because at least it's on the agenda, it's being talked about, and it's reaching into many, many different areas: private sector, the public sector, the multilateral banks, the NGOs, and at the government level. So I think that's very encouraging. I'm very struck, Minister, by what the tree planting program in the Aral Sea, and I'm just wondering if we cast ahead, I don't know, 20 years, whether the Aral Sea will become the Aral Forest. I don't know. But maybe that will be a welcome, not a restoration of an original, but perhaps an enhancement in some way. Would you join me all in thanking our panel for a really great discussion? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
very
you,
much.
David.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great moderation.
Thank you very much indeed.